Vietnamese intelligence officers stared at captured radio intercepts in confusion, trying to piece together what they were facing. Two different SAS units were supposedly operating in Phuoc Tuy Province during 1969, but the patterns made no sense. Same tactics, identical movements, command structures that seemed to shift mid-patrol, radio procedures that matched perfectly. Even the trail discipline looked identical from their observation posts. The North Vietnamese Army had developed detailed profiles of most Allied units, how Americans moved, how Australians set ambushes, how different forces revealed their presence. But these SAS patrols defied classification. Sometimes they operated as Australians, sometimes as New Zealanders, often as something in between that didn't fit any known Allied structure. The enemy couldn't tell them apart. What's more remarkable, neither could most Allied forces working in the same province. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, 1968. The Australian task force had established control over this critical region located southeast of Saigon, positioned directly across known infiltration routes that North Vietnamese forces used to move supplies, weapons, and personnel toward the capital. Two elite units deployed to this theater: the Australian Special Air Service Regiment and New Zealand Special Air Service. On paper, they were separate national entities. Both descended from British SAS lineage, trained in similar reconnaissance doctrine, operated in four-man patrols designed for deep penetration missions. Standard Allied cooperation between Commonwealth nations. Right? Wrong. What developed between 1968 and 1971 in the jungles and rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy wasn't just coordination or cooperation. It was operational fusion at a level rarely achieved between military forces of different sovereign nations. These units didn't work alongside each other in the traditional sense. They became interchangeable parts of a single reconnaissance machine. Military historians who later analyzed the deployment documented this as the most deeply integrated special operations partnership of the entire Vietnam War, surpassing even units that shared the same national command structure. The Australians brought institutional experience from earlier Vietnam deployments and larger personnel numbers. The New Zealanders contributed specialized training methods and personnel selected through one of the world's most demanding selection courses. Together, they created something neither could have achieved alone. But nobody in Allied command expected what came next when these Anzac forces entered the jungle together and started erasing the boundaries between their national identities. Military doctrine across every modern army says different national units maintain separate command structures. It's not just about sovereignty or politics. Cultural differences in how soldiers communicate, operational procedures developed through different training systems, varying national interests and rules of engagement. These create natural boundaries even between the closest allies. Joint operations typically mean parallel efforts with careful coordination, not true integration. Yet Australian and New Zealand SAS personnel rotated leadership roles during the same patrol, sometimes multiple times in a single mission. A Kiwi patrol commander would directly command Australian troopers in contact situations. Australian sergeants led New Zealand teams through enemy territory without any adjustment period. They used identical hand signals developed collaboratively, moved with the same silent discipline refined in combined training, even shared ration packs, ammunition, and equipment without logistical complications or second thoughts. When a patrol called for extraction, helicopter crews couldn't always identify which nationality they were retrieving until faces became visible. The radio procedures, terminology, and emergency protocols were indistinguishable. How does this level of integration happen between sovereign nations in an active combat zone? How do you erase national boundaries without compromising operational effectiveness or creating command confusion? The answer reveals something profound about what's possible when military culture transcends politics. Records from the Australian War Memorial show the integration began long before boots hit Vietnamese soil. This wasn't a field experiment or accidental evolution. It was deliberate construction. Both SAS units trained at the same facilities in Australia months before deployment. New Zealand troopers spent extensive periods at Swanbourne Barracks in Western Australia. running identical scenarios with their Australian counterparts through the same terrain, using the same methods. The selection processes that fed personnel into both units were nearly identical by design. Both required candidates to complete grueling endurance marches carrying heavy loads across punishing terrain. Navigation tests under sleep deprivation. Psychological evaluations specifically designed to identify men who could operate in four-man patrols for weeks without resupply, under constant threat, maintaining absolute silence. According to documented training records preserved in military archives, pass rates hovered around 12 to 15% for both nations. The standards weren't just similar, they were effectively identical. This created a foundation. Men who passed NZSAS selection could operate seamlessly with men who passed Australian SAS selection because they'd proven the same capabilities under the same conditions. The filtering process removed those who couldn't adapt, leaving personnel predisposed to the integration that would follow. Intelligence briefings were shared completely without restriction. Unlike conventional forces where information followed strict national channels and required formal liaison procedures, NZSAS and Australian SAS officers sat in the same briefing rooms, analyzed the same enemy patterns, and planned operational responses together. This wasn't liaison work where one nation briefs another. It was unified planning where nationality became irrelevant to the process. Before the first joint patrol stepped into Phuoc Tuy's dense jungle, both units established common operating procedures through intensive collaboration. Radio frequencies matched across all channels. Emergency extraction protocols aligned perfectly, down to specific smoke signals and helicopter approach angles. Even medical evacuation procedures followed identical steps, meaning a wounded Kiwi could be treated by an Australian medic using the same training manual, the same techniques, without any adaptation or confusion under fire. The Australian Task Force commander, according to preserved military documentation, issued standing orders that treated both SAS units as a single reconnaissance asset available for tasking. Mission assignments went to whoever was available and best positioned for the specific operation. Nationality didn't factor into the tactical equation. This administrative decision, seemingly minor in the broader war effort, created the bureaucratic foundation for what followed in the field. Equipment standardization happened organically. Both units used the same weapons, primarily the L1A1 self-loading rifle, though some specialists carried suppressed weapons or captured AK-47s for deception purposes. The same radio sets, same webbing configurations. Even camouflage patterns and field modifications followed similar evolution as both units adapted to the same environment. Operational reports preserved from 1969 through 1970 document the pattern that emerged in practice. A typical reconnaissance patrol moving through enemy-controlled territory might include 2 Australians and 2 New Zealanders. The patrol commander for that specific mission could be from either nation, selected based on experience with that particular terrain type or familiarity with the intelligence target, not based on passport or national seniority. Documentation indicates these mixed patrols operated extensively in the long high hills and the Mae Tao region, areas thick with North Vietnamese infiltration routes, weapons caches, and base camps. They moved using identical bushcraft techniques, the ghost walk method of silent movement that both units had independently developed and then refined together. This involved specific foot placement, weight distribution, and movement timing that left minimal trace and created almost no sound even in dense vegetation. Vietnamese forces, according to captured documents examined by Allied intelligence officers after the war, reported significant difficulty identifying which specific SAS element they were facing. Their intelligence summaries, translated years later, show confusion about whether they were tracking one large unit or multiple smaller ones, and whether these were Australian or New Zealand forces. This wasn't deliberate deception by Allied forces. It was the natural result of operational integration creating a unified signature. The tactical language became seamless through repetition and shared experience. Both forces used the same terminology for immediate action drills, the split-second responses to enemy contact that mean survival or death in close jungle encounters. When contact occurred, every trooper knew exactly what break contact delta or close target recce meant regardless of accent or national origin. After-action reports show response times during firefights match those of single nationality patrols. There was no hesitation, no translation delay, no moment of confusion about who commanded what action. One documented incident from 1970 illustrates the integration depth achieved. An Australian-led patrol with New Zealand members encountered superior North Vietnamese forces during a reconnaissance mission and called for emergency extraction under fire. The quick reaction force that responded included both NZSAS and Australian SAS personnel, assembled from whoever was available at the forward operating base. According to the operational report filed afterward, the rescuing force didn't know which nationality had called for help until after successful extraction, and it didn't matter for the operation's execution. The rescue force knew SAS patrol procedures, knew likely defensive positions, knew radio protocols. National identity was operationally irrelevant. Intelligence gathered by these joint patrols fed into the same analysis system without national filtering. Enemy movement reports, weapons cache discoveries, trail monitoring data, prisoner interrogation results, all entered a shared database accessible to planners from both nations. Task Force intelligence officers, according to archived documents, stopped distinguishing between Australian and New Zealand intelligence sources in their reports. The information's quality and accuracy mattered. Its national origin became an administrative detail rather than an operational factor. The patrol rotation system meant the same piece of terrain might be monitored by an Australian patrol one week and a New Zealand patrol the next, with complete continuity and understanding. Handover briefings between patrols focused on enemy patterns and terrain features, not on explaining how the other nation operated. Both forces left the same trail markers, used the same cache locations for emergency supplies, and followed the same infiltration routes. The North Vietnamese adapted their own procedures in response to SAS pressure, but their captured documents reveal persistent confusion. References to the SAS appeared in Vietnamese intelligence summaries without national identifiers. Some Vietnamese commanders, according to translated intelligence reports analyzed after the war, believed they faced a single large elite unit rather than two separate national forces operating in the same area. The integration had created an unintentional operational deception that complicated enemy planning. Between 1968 and 1971, records indicate NZSAS deployed approximately 140 personnel total to Vietnam across multiple rotations, while Australian SAS maintained a larger continuous presence with several squadrons rotating through Nundock, their forward operating base. Yet casualty statistics and operational effectiveness rates, according to Australian War Memorial data and New Zealand defence records, showed no significant performance difference between integrated mixed nationality patrols and single nationality operations. The integration didn't create vulnerabilities, it simply worked. The patrol system documented over this 3-year period completed hundreds of reconnaissance missions across Phuoc Tuy Province. Intelligence reports credited these joint operations with locating major enemy supply caches that were subsequently destroyed, identifying key infiltration routes that were then interdicted, and providing early warning of North Vietnamese unit movements toward Allied positions. Task Force commanders, in documented communications preserved in military archives, specifically requested SAS assets for critical reconnaissance missions without specifying nationality, a practice that would have been highly unusual with other Allied forces where national identity determined capability and availability. Perhaps most significantly from a military doctrine perspective, the command rotation system proved sustainable under actual combat conditions over an extended period. No documented incidents show command confusion, hesitation during contact, or friction in decision-making during joint patrols. After-action reports consistently indicate that mixed nationality teams performed immediate action drills, the most critical test of unit cohesion. with the same precision and speed as single nationality patrols. This suggests the integration reached muscle memory level among participants, not just procedural agreement or intellectual understanding. The tactical innovations developed jointly also proved valuable. Both units refined ambush techniques specifically adapted to Vietnamese terrain and enemy tactics, counter-tracking methods to avoid North Vietnamese trackers, water discipline for extended patrols in tropical heat. These innovations spread through both organizations simultaneously, as shared experience meant shared learning. When NZSAS withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, followed by Australian SAS forces later as the war wound down, the operational lessons were formally documented by both nations' military establishments. Both services recorded the patrol procedures, integration protocols, command rotation methods, and communication systems in official training materials. These weren't filed as historical curiosities or unique wartime adaptations. They became doctrine for future combined operations between the two nations. The Australian and New Zealand defense establishments, according to official military histories published decades later, recognized what had been achieved. This wasn't just successful cooperation between allies, the usual story of joint operations. It was proof that properly integrated special operations forces from different sovereign nations could function as a unified operational element without sacrificing effectiveness or compromising national sovereignty. The political structures remained separate, but the operational reality had transcended national boundaries. The Vietnam integration established operational patterns and institutional relationships that continue today, more than 5 decades later. When Australian and New Zealand SAS deployed to Afghanistan in 2001, as part of the initial response to the September 11th attacks, they immediately implemented combined patrol procedures based directly on documentation from the Vietnam-era operations. Military analysts observing the deployment noted the seamless integration happened faster and more completely than with any other coalition partners, including nations with closer geographic proximity or larger force contributions. During operations in Iraq and subsequent Middle East deployments throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the same principle held across different operational environments. Task force commanders could assign NZSAS and Australian SAS personnel to the same missions, the same capture-kill operations against high-value targets, without additional integration training or adjustment periods. The foundation built in Phuoc Tuy Province remained operationally solid 5 decades later, adapted to new enemies and new technologies, but fundamentally unchanged in principle. Australian war memorial records and New Zealand defense publications show this partnership influenced special operations doctrine, well beyond the Anzac nations themselves. British SAS observers in Vietnam documented the integration methods in detail and recommended similar approaches for future coalition operations in official reports. The concept of command rotation during active patrols, once considered risky or impractical by conventional military wisdom, became accepted practice in multinational special operations forces. The personnel relationships established in Vietnam created lasting institutional connections. Veterans from both services maintained contact, shared lessons, and influenced the next generation of operators. When those Vietnam veterans rose to senior positions in both organizations, they ensured the integration remained doctrine rather than historical footnote. Current New Zealand and Australian defense cooperation agreements specifically reference the Vietnam experience as proof of concept for deep operational integration. When both nations discuss combined military capabilities today in strategic planning documents, they cite Phuoc Tuy Province as the template that works under actual combat conditions, not just peacetime theory or exercise scenarios. The intelligence sharing systems developed in Vietnam also established patterns that expanded beyond special operations. Both nations' broader defense and intelligence establishments recognized that the SAS integration model offered lessons for other forms of military cooperation. While full integration remained unique to special operations forces, the principles of shared planning, common procedures, and unified command influenced other areas of Anzac defense cooperation. But Vietnam wasn't the only place where Anzac Special Operations Forces wrote military history together. Decades later, in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan's Phuoc Province, NZSAS and Australian SAS would face a completely different enemy under entirely different operational conditions. What they discovered was that the lessons from Vietnamese jungles translated directly to Afghan valleys, and the integration went even deeper than their predecessors had achieved in 1969. The night raids they conducted together changed how coalition forces hunted Taliban leadership across the entire theater. If you want to explore more documented special operations partnerships and real military history, subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment. Which Anzac military operation should we detail next? Until then.